A U.S. bomber vanished over Alaska. There was no distress call, and no survivors were expected. One man parachuted into the frozen wilderness and was soon declared dead. The search was called off, but somewhere deep in Alaska, he was still alive, still walking, covering 120 meg just to survive. December 21st, 1943, Ladfield, Fairbanks, Alaska. Ladfield, now known as Fort Wright, was one of the most important Arctic testing hubs of the U.S. Army Air Forces during the Second World War. Here, aircraft and men were pushed to their limits in temperatures that could engines and kill the unprepared in minutes. On this morning, a consolidated B-24 Liberator, tail number 424910, waited at the edge of the field, its aluminum skin already frosting over. The mission was not combat. It was a routine cold weather test flight over Alaska's interior, part of the Army Air or Cold Weather Testing Detachment. Routine but never safe. Among the 5 men climbing aboard was Leon Crane, a young lieutenant serving as co-pilot. Crane was experienced but still early in his career, one of many airmen learning how machines and humans behaved in the Arctic. At the controls sat the pilot Harold Hoskin, known to everyone as Hoss. Steady and methodical flight engineer Richard Pompeo moved through his checks with quiet efficiency, while radio operator Ralph W.S. monitored frequencies that often crackled and died in the polar atmosphere. Completing the crew was James E. Seibert, another young airman accustomed to long hours and cold metal. None of them had any reason to believe this flight would be remembered. At 9:45 a.m., the B-24 rolled down the icy runway and lifted into the pale Alaskan sky. The engines roared with a familiar vibration, and for a time, everything went as planned. Below them stretched an endless wilderness of frozen rivers, dark spruce forests, and white ridge lines broken only by the occasional glint of ice reflecting the sun. At 10:03 a.m., the crew reported a routine radio fix. Another followed at 10:30. Each transmission placed them deeper into Alaska's interior, far from settlements, roads, or rescue. By 11 a.m., the weather began to change. Clouds thickened into a heavy gray ceiling, swallowing the horizon. Visibility dropped, and the aircraft entered a world of white and shadow, where sky and ground seemed to blend together. Inside the cockpit, the temperature was cold, but manageable, the kind of cold that seeped into gloves and stiffened fingers. Outside, it was lethal. At altitude, the air temperature plunged well below 40° F. The B-24 climbed toward 20,000 FT, its engines straining in the thin, frozen air. Then, without warning, trouble struck. The number 1 engine began to lose power, its rhythm faltering before cutting out entirely. Almost simultaneously, the vacuum selector valve froze solid, robbing the crew of reliable instrument reading. In clear skies, a skilled pilot might compensate. In dense cloud with no horizon and failing systems, the situation turned critical in seconds. The aircraft began to yaw, then roll. Hoskin fought the controls, calling out commands as Pompeo shouted readings, and WS tried to raise anyone on the radio. The wind howled around the fuselage, rising in pitch as the plane lost altitude. Warning alarms cut through the noise, sharp and insistent. The B-24 entered a spin, dropping from 20,000 FT toward unseen terrain below. Gravity pressed the men into their seats as centrifugal force made every movement harder. There was no visual reference, no clear sense of direction, only instruments that were no longer trustworthy, and the terrifying knowledge that the ground was somewhere beneath them, rising fast. Crane later recalled the chaos of those moments as both loud and strangely unreal. Training took over. There was no time for panic, only decisions. Hoskin struggled to regain control, but the aircraft continued to spiral. The clouds outside the cockpit windows were thick as wool, offering no hint of how close they were to disaster. Somewhere below lay the rugged mountains near the Charlie River, their slopes buried under deep winter snow. The B-24 was descending directly toward them. With control slipping away and impact imminent, the crew faced the unthinkable choice between staying with the aircraft or abandoning it. As the altimeter unwound at a terrifying speed, Hoskin gave the order to bail out. The words cut through the noise with finality. Crane unbuckled, his hands stiff and clumsy in the cold. Moving through the aircraft was like fighting against an invisible force. Every step heavy as the plane spun. He reached the bomb bay, forced the doors open, and was hit by a blast of frigid air that stole his breath. There was no time to look back, no way to know what the others would do. He jumped. For a brief, disorienting moment, there was only darkness and wind. Then the parachute snapped open with a violent jerk that wrenched his body upward. The roar of the engines vanished, replaced by the rush of air, and an eerie silence broken only by the flapping of fabric. Somewhere above him, the B-24 continued its fatal descent. Seconds later, a dull, distant explosion echoed through the clouds as the aircraft struck a remote mountaintop and erupted in flames, scattering wreckage across the snow. Crane did not see it. He was already falling through the gray toward the unknown. The descent felt endless. The cold intensified as he dropped lower, the air biting through his flight gear. When his boots finally struck the ground, he plunged hip deep into powdery snow. The impact knocked the wind from him, and for a moment he lay still, stunned, listening to his own breathing. When he stood, the world around him was silent and vast, a frozen landscape of trees and ridges stretching in every direction. The temperature hovered around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. There was no sign of the aircraft, no smoke, no sound of voices, just wilderness. Crane's first instinct was to call out. He shouted, "Ho!" into the empty air, hoping against reason that his pilot or another crew member might answer. The sound vanished into the trees. He called again, louder. Nothing came back. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. Slowly, the reality settled over him. He was alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest town in the dead of an Alaskan winter. Whatever had happened to the others, he could not see them, could not reach them. Survival, if it was possible at all, would depend entirely on what he did next. He took stock of what he had. The inventory was brutally short. 2 packs of matches, a small Boy Scout knife, his parachute now tangled and half buried in snow. No rifle, no food, no sleeping bag, no map, no radio. What training he had in survival would have to bridge an enormous gap between what he carried and what the environment demanded. The cold was already creeping through his clothing, numbing his fingers and toes. He knew that standing still was dangerous. Movement meant warmth, and warmth meant time. Looking around, Crane tried to orient himself. The terrain sloped downward, and through the trees, he believed he could make out the shape of a valley. Based on the aircraft's heading before the bailout, he guessed that the Charlie River lay somewhere below, cutting a winding path through the interior toward the Yukon. Rivers, he knew, were lifelines in the wilderness. They offered direction, ice for water, and sometimes cabins or trails left by trappers. If he could reach the valley floor, he might have a chance. He gathered his parachute, stuffing as much of it as he could under his arm, and began to move downhill. Each step was an effort. The snow swallowed his legs and fallen branches hid beneath the surface, waiting to trip him. The cold burned his lungs as he breathed. Behind him, somewhere beyond the clouds, lay the shattered remains of the B-24 and the lives that had been aborted. Ahead of him lay an unknown distance of frozen wilderness. December 21st, 1943, would end with Leon Crane alive, but stranded, beginning a journey that would test the limits of human endurance in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Night fell quickly in the Alaskan interior, not with a gradual dimming, but like a door closing. The sky turned from gray to deep blue, and then to black, and the temperature dropped with it, sinking hard toward 40 degrees F. Snow lay everywhere, soft and deceptively deep, swallowing sound and distance. Leon Crane stood alone at the edge of the valley, the silence so complete it felt unnatural. The parachute that had saved his life now became his only shelter. He dragged it close, shaking snow from the folds, and I wrapped it around his shoulders and legs as tightly as he could. The fabric offered little warmth, but it cut the wind just enough to slow the cold that was already creeping into his bones. Crane knew the first night would be critical. If he slept unprotected, he would not wake up. His hands were stiff as he searched for dry wood, snapping dead spruce branches and breaking them into short lengths. Each movement burned energy he could not replace, but stopping meant freezing. He scraped together a small pile of twigs, shielding them from the wind with his body, and reached for his matches. 2 packs, that was all. He struck one, shielding the flame with cupped hands, and watched it flicker dangerously close to going out. The first attempt failed, the flame hissing and dying against damp wood. His heart pounded harder than it had during the bailout. He tried again, forcing himself to slow down, to breathe. The second match caught, and this time, a thin thread of smoke curled upward. A tiny fire came to life, barely more than glowing embers, but enough to offer hope. As the fire struggled, Crane's thoughts raced. Fear crept in, sharp and insistent. He wondered where the others had landed, whether anyone else had survived, whether a rescue plane might already be circling somewhere overhead. The darkness answered none of it. Hunger gnawed at him, a hollow ache that felt unreal at first, like something distant. He had eaten earlier that morning, but the cold burned calories mercilessly. Every shiver drained strength. He remembered later saying that the cold was not just uncomfortable, but aggressive, something that seemed to press against him from every direction, demanding surrender. That night, wrapped in parachute silk beside a fragile fire, he fought it minute by minute, feeding twigs into the flames and stamping his feet to keep blood moving. Sleep came in fragments, short and shallow. Each time he drifted off, the fire would fade and the cold would snap him. "Await!" His fingers burned, then went numb, then burned again. He checked them constantly, flexing them, terrified of frostbite setting in while he slept. Above him, the sky glittered with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, beautiful and indifferent. There was no sound but the faint crackle of the fire and the soft rush of his own breath. By morning, the fire had died completely, leaving only a blackened patch in the snow. Crane stood slowly, his body stiff and aching, amazed that he was still alive. The days that followed blurred into one another, marked less by time than by exhaustion. Crane fashioned crude clothing from the parachute, wrapping strips of fabric around his legs and torso, tying them with cord cut from the rigging. It was awkward and heavy, but it trapped some heat and kept the snow from soaking his uniform completely. He moved cautiously through the valley, following what he believed to be the course of the river below. The landscape offered no comfort. Endless white stretched in every direction, broken by dark spruce and the slow winding path of ice that marked it the river. The wind rose and fell without warning, sometimes screaming through the trees, sometimes dying to an eerie calm. Food quickly became an obsession. Crane tried to hunt squirrel, spotting their tracks near trees and attempting to corner them with a sharpened stick. His efforts failed every time. The animals were fast and alert, disappearing up trunks or vanishing into holes in the snow. Each failure cost him energy and morale. Hunger sharpened his thoughts and dulled them at the same time, making it hard to focus for long. His stomach cramped and his mouth felt dry no matter how much snow he melted. He learned to chip through river ice with his knife, scraping until he reached flowing water beneath. The water was icy and tasted faintly of metal, but it kept him alive. For 9 days, it would be the only thing he consumed. As the days passed, the effects of cold became visible. His fingers swelled and discolored, patches of skin turning pale and then grayish white. His toes burned with a deep aching pain that flared whenever he stopped moving. He massaged his hands constantly, rubbing them against his thighs, blowing warm breath into his gloves. He knew enough to fear frostbite, to understand that once tissue froze completely, it might never recover. Every morning he inspected his hands and feet with growing dread, wondering how much damage had already been done. The cold was relentless, offering no mercy and no pause. Emotionally, Crane walked a narrow line between determination and panic. At times, he felt strangely calm, focused entirely on immediate tasks. Gather wood, make fire, find water, keep moving. At other moments, fear surged without warning. He imagined rescue aircraft flying far above the clouds, never seeing him. He imagined collapsing in the snow, too weak to stand. To fend off panic, he talked to himself out loud, narrating his actions, giving himself orders. He later said that keeping his mind occupied was as important as keeping his body warm. Silence in that vast white world could become dangerous if it allowed fear to grow unchecked. By the end of the 9th day, the truth became impossible to ignore. No rescue had come. No distant engine noise broke the silence. No parachutes dotted the snow around him. Crane understood what this meant. The crash site was likely too remote, the weather too poor, and the search area too vast. Waiting any longer would only weaken him further. The realization was heavy, but it brought clarity. If he wanted to live, he would have to find his own way out. He chose to move north, following the frozen river as best he could. Rivers he believed would eventually lead to people, trappers, miners, someone. It was a gamble, but staying where he was guaranteed nothing. The decision marked a shift from passive endurance to active survival. Each step northward felt like an act of defiance against the cold, and the odds stacked against him. He packed what little he had, adjusted his parachute clothing, and set off. The isolation deepened as he moved. The world narrowed to the crunch of snow under his boots, the rasp of his breath, and the constant pressure of wind against his face. The white landscape seemed endless, erasing any sense of scale. Without landmarks, distance became deceptive. A bend in the river that looked close could take hours to reach. Fatigue settled into his muscles, a deep bone-level weariness that rest did little to ease. Still, he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping for too long could be fatal. From above, the Charlie River Valley was a vast empty corridor carved through the wilderness, its frozen surface winding toward the Yukon, far beyond Crane's sight. On maps, it looked like a thin line in a sea of white, emphasizing just how small and exposed one man was within it. On the ground, it felt even larger. The wind swept unobstructed along the river, carrying fine snow that stung his face and filled his tracks behind him, erasing evidence that he had ever passed through. By the time Crane committed fully to the journey north, he was physically diminished but mentally hardened. Hunger was a constant companion, cold and ever-present threat, and fear something he learned to keep at arm's length. The first 9 days had stripped survival down to its essentials: fire, water, movement, no comfort, no certainty. As he disappeared deeper into the Charlie River Valley, leaving the crash site far behind, he stepped into the next phase of an ordeal that would test not just his body, but the limits of human will. By the time Leon Crane saw the cabin, daylight was already thinning, the pale winter sun sagging toward the treetops. He had been forcing his way through deep snow for hours, each step heavier than the last, his legs burning with fatigue and his stomach aching with hunger that had become constant and dull. At first, the shape ahead of him seemed like another trick of the landscape, a darker patch against the endless white. But as he moved closer, straight lines emerged where none should exist in nature. A roof line, a wall, a door half buried under drifted snow. It was real, a cabin in a place where he had begun to believe nothing man-made existed at all. The cabin was nearly swallowed by winter. Snow climbed halfway up the walls and the roof sagged slightly under its weight. The door was stiff with ice, and Crane had to lean his shoulder into it, pushing until it creaked inward with a sound that felt impossibly loud in the silence. Inside, the air was cold and stale, but sheltered from the wind. Light filtered through a small, frost-coated window, revealing a single-room trapper's cabin, rough-hewn but solid. For a moment, Crane simply stood there breathing, letting the fact of shelter sink in. After days of exposure, the feeling of being enclosed, of having walls around him, was overwhelming. He began to explore the cabin slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid the discovery might vanish if he moved too fast. Against one wall sat shelves lined with supplies, cans, real food, beans, meat, tins he barely recognized, but knew would keep him alive. There were sacks of sugar and powdered milk, their contents hardened by cold but usable. In a corner leaned a rifle, its metal dark and worn, with boxes of ammunition nearby. Rolled tents lay stacked along another wall, and hanging from pegs were heavy moose hide mittens, thick and scarred from use. Each item felt miraculous. Crane had not eaten solid food in 9 days. The sight of it made his hands tremble. This cabin belonged to Phil Burrell, a trapper known for building and stocking cabins throughout the interior. Bale had prepared these shelters for long winters and emergencies, never knowing who might one day depend on them. Without meeting him, without even knowing his name at the time, Crane owed him his life. The supplies were not abundant, but they were enough. Enough to rest, enough to recover, enough to hope again. Crane moved with renewed purpose. He cleared snow from the stove, coaxed it back to life, and fed it with wood from a stacked pile inside the cabin. When the stove finally caught, the warmth spread slowly, unevenly, but it was warmth nonetheless. He opened a can with his knife and set it on the stove to heat. The smell of food filled the cabin, rich and almost painful in its intensity. When he ate, it was slowly at first, careful not to overwhelm a body that had been running on nothing but water and willpower. Each bite felt grounding, anchoring him back to himself. He drank warm liquid made from powdered milk and sugar, feeling heat spread through his chest. For the first time since the crash, he felt something close to safe. Crane stayed in that cabin for days, allowing his body to do what it had not been able to do since December 21st. He rested. He slept deeply, wrapped in real blankets, waking to the quiet crackle of the stove. He inspected his hands and feet in better light and saw the damage clearly now. Frostbite had taken hold. His fingers were swollen, discolored, and stiff. His toes ached constantly. The pain flaring whenever warmth returned to them. He treated them as best he could, keeping them clean and warm, moving them gently to restore circulation. Recovery was slow, but food and shelter made it possible. As his strength returned, so did his clarity of thought. Crane took inventory of the cabin, learning what he could rely on and what he could not. He rationed supplies carefully, knowing that this place was a refuge, not an endpoint. One afternoon, while searching through a battered wooden chest, he found something that changed everything: an old map of Alaska. The paper was yellowed and creased, its edges soft from years of use, but the lines were clear enough. Rivers, mountain ranges, scattered settlements marked by small names. Crane spread it out on the table and studied it for hours. The map confirmed what he had feared. He was deep in the interior, far from any major settlement. Ladfield lay hundreds of miles away. There were no roads nearby, no easy routes, but the map also offered a direction. Following the Charlie River north and west would eventually lead to the Yukon River, a major artery of travel even in winter. Along the Yukon lay small communities and mining camps, places where people still live despite the cold. One name stood out: Woodchopper, a mining camp along the Yukon River, isolated but inhabited. It was far, but it was something. A destination, however distant, gave his suffering meaning. During that week in the cabin, Crane reflected on what had happened and what lay ahead. The cabin was a gift, but it was also a reminder of how precarious his situation remained. Supplies would not last forever. Rescue was still unlikely. If he stayed too long, he risked losing the narrow window he had to reach civilization while his strength was returning. The decision to move on formed slowly but firmly. When he felt strong enough to walk again, he packed what he could carry, leaving the rest behind, and stepped back out into the cold. He followed the river further, pushing beyond the comfort of known shelter. Driven by the hope that Burrell's cabin was not the only one, the snow grew deeper in places, crusted over in others, forcing him to adjust his pace constantly. The landscape remained unforgiving, beautiful in its emptiness, but hostile in every practical sense. After hours of travel, he came upon another structure. From a distance, it looked promising, another cabin half buried in snow. Up close, the illusion shattered. The roof had collapsed inward, the walls warped and split. Inside, there was nothing but debris and ice. No food, no stove, no refuge. It was a hollow shell, offering only disappointment. He pressed on, hope thinning but not gone. Eventually, he found a second cabin. This one stood a little straighter, but the door hung crooked on its hinges and snow drifted freely inside. The interior was stripped bare, shelves empty, floor littered with old scraps and mouse droppings. Whatever supplies had once been there were long gone. Crane stood in the doorway for a long moment, the wind blowing through the broken structure, carrying fine snow across the floor. 2 cabins, both useless. The message was clear. Shelter in this wilderness was rare, and reliable shelter even rarer. With daylight fading again, Crane turned back. The decision to return to Burrell's cabin was not made lightly. Each step back felt like a concession to reality, an acknowledgement of limits, but it was also a strategic choice. That cabin represented warmth, food, and time. Time to plan, time to recover further, time to prepare for the longer journey ahead. As he walked back through his own fading tracks, the landscape seemed to close in around him, the white pressing against the dark lines of trees like a living thing. Back inside the cabin, Crane restarted the stove and settled in once more. The contrast between the safety of those walls and the emptiness outside sharpened his understanding of the stakes. The cabin was both a sanctuary and a reminder. It showed him that survival was possible, that preparation and foresight could make the difference between life and death. At the same time, it underscored how easily hope could collapse, like the roofs of the abandoned cabins he had just visited. Snow continued to fall outside, soft and relentless, covering his tracks, erasing evidence of his movements. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting warm light over rough-hewn logs and the supplies that had kept him alive.